Some nights the cold doesn't just bite. It judges. It decides who's worth keeping warm and who isn't, and it does it quietly, the way a town does, with closed doors and drawn curtains, and the small mercy of not having to look you in the eye while you freeze. I've lived a long time, long enough to learn that a place will tell you exactly what it loves by watching who it lets die on its doorstep. The winter I want to tell you about, a woman came to our town with nothing but a dead man's coat, and a face the wind had already started to take. And every door she knocked on, every single one opened just wide enough to say no, then shut before her think, you could finish. Every door but one. I was there for all of it. I saw the town make its choice. And I saw one man, a man most folks already had reasons not to like, make a different one, not because he was good exactly, but because he couldn't stand in his own warm house and listen to a woman die 40 feet away. Stay with me, because what happened after he opened that door is the part nobody in Harlan likes to talk about, and the part I've never been able to forget. The thing I remember first isn't the cold. It's the sound her knuckles made on the boarding house door. Soft, too soft. By then her hands were already past the point of doing what she told them, and the knock came out like something a moth would do against a window, a flutter, an apology. I was standing across the road under the livery overhang, blowing into my fists, waiting on Jonah to finish whatever fool errand had him inside the feed store after dark, and I watched her stand on Della Forsythe's porch and lift a hand that didn't want to lift. Knock, wait, knock. The lamp inside went dim, not out, dim. Somebody had cupped a hand around it. I want to be honest with you, because if I make myself out as the good one in this, I'll have lied to you in the first 5 minutes and you'll have every right to quit listening. I didn't move. I stood there and I told myself the same thing the whole town was telling itself behind their curtains, that she wasn't my business, that somebody else would see to it, that a stranger walking into Harlan on the coldest night of the year was a problem with 100 better-positioned owners than a 56-year-old ranch hand with a bad hip and no house of his own to offer. I keep a little book, always have, tally of the cattle, whether, what we paid for nails, who owes who. A foreman once told me a man who writes things down is a man who doesn't trust his own memory, and he meant it as an insult, and I took it as one and kept doing it anyway. That night I had the book in my coat and I remember thinking, almost without meaning to, what's the date, the way you do when something is happening that you'll want to find again later. December the 9th. I wrote it down 2 days after when my hands worked. December the 9th, the night the town said no. Della opened the door the second time. I'll give her that, she opened it. We're full, she said. We weren't full. Everybody on that road knew we weren't full. Harlan in December had maybe one stagecoach a week, and half of those carried nothing but mail and a drummer selling liniment. Della had 4 empty rooms and a fire going, and she said we're full to a woman whose lips had gone the color of a bruise. The widow, I didn't know she was a widow yet, didn't know anything, only that she was a woman alone and the coat she wore was a man's coat, cut for shoulders broader than hers. The widow said something I couldn't hear. Quiet. Then Della said the thing that I've turned over in my head more times than I can count. You'd best try the church, she said, or keep on to Bishop's Crossing. There's nothing for you here. There's nothing for you here. Like a town could be a thing a person was simply not entitled to. The door shut. The lamp came back up, and the woman stood on the porch a moment with her chin down, and then she did the thing that undid me, that I think about still. She didn't argue. She didn't pound the door or curse or weep. She just nodded, like the answer was one she'd already gotten 3 or 4 times that night and had learned the shape of. She nodded at a shut door, and she turned around, and she came down the steps into the road, and the wind took the bottom of that big coat and showed me how little there was of her inside it. She tried the Hadleys next. I watched her go up that walk too, same nod coming back down. She tried the store where Prout lived in the back. The light never even moved. You learn the temperature in your bones out here without a thermometer, And that night was below anything I'd have driven cattle in, below anything you'd leave a dog out in. And she was on her fourth or fifth no and slowing down between them now. And I stood under that overhang and felt the cold start to win the argument I was having with myself. I'll tell you what finally moved me because it wasn't goodness. It was a smaller, stupider thing. She fell. Not all the way. She caught herself on the trough rail at the corner, went down to one knee in the frozen mud, and stayed there a second longer than a person stays who's getting right back up. And some animal part of me that doesn't ask permission was already off the boards and into the road before the rest of me had finished deciding. That's when Jonah came out of the feed store. I have to tell you about Jonah, or none of the rest will land the way it should. Jonah Mercer ran a poor spread 2 miles east of town, 40 head on a good year, and he ran it mostly alone except for me and a boy named Sully who came on at branding. He'd come to Harlan 11 years before with a wife named Esther and buried her 4 years after that fever, the same winter that took half the children on the East Road, and he never remarried and never said much about it, and the town, in the way of towns, decided that a man who keeps to himself is a man with something to keep. They didn't dislike Jonah for any one thing. They disliked him the way you dislike a closed door in your own house. He didn't laugh at the right times. He didn't come to church but twice a year. He'd taken Prout to account in front of the whole store once over a weighted scale and been right about it, which is the kind of being right a small town never forgives. So when I tell you that the one man who came across that road was a man the town already had reasons not to like, that's not a coincidence I'm dressing up for you. That's just how it tends to go. The people with the least to protect are usually the ones who can afford to be kind. He reached her before I did, got a hand under her arm, and I heard him say, not soft, not a question, up you come. She said, I'm all right, which was a lie so plain it almost made me laugh, except nothing about it was funny. You're not, Jonah said. You're freezing to death in front of a town that's pretending not to watch. Come on. And here's the part, she pulled back. I swear to you she pulled back. Half froze on her knees, fifth door of the night, and when a man finally said come on, she pulled against his hand like the offer was a trap. I understood it later. By then she'd learned that in Harlan, a thing offered was a thing about to be taken back, and she'd rather meet the cold she already knew than the cruelty she was waiting for. But in the moment all I saw was a dying woman trying to refuse the only hand reaching for her, and all I saw was Jonah not letting go. I don't take charity, she said, teeth going. I'll pay. I have. And her hand went toward a small bag at her side, fumbling, and she couldn't work the cord, her fingers were past working anything, and she kept trying anyway. That's the thing I keep, she kept trying to pay him while she froze. Stop, Jonah said, gentler now. Nobody said anything about pay, Amos. That's me, get the wagon. I got the wagon. I don't remember much of the loading. I remember she weighed nothing. I remember Jonah put his own coat over the man's coat she already wore, and she let him finally, because by then there wasn't enough of her left to refuse with. I remember Della Forsyth's curtain moving as we pulled out, and I remember thinking, with a meanness I'm not proud of and won't pretend I didn't feel, take a good look. And I remember the woman, in the bed of that wagon, going in and out, saying one word a few times like she was answering somebody who wasn't there. It took me a mile to make it out over the wheels and the wind. Thomas, she was saying Thomas. I didn't know yet who Thomas was. I didn't know he was the reason every door in town had shut. I only knew the way she said it, not like a name, like an address she was trying to get back to. We got her to the ranch house and Jonah did everything right, which surprised me, though I don't know why it should have. A man who's nursed a wife through a fever knows things the rest of us have to be told. He didn't pile her by the fire, said you bring a froze person up slow or you stop their heart doing it. Warm cloths. Blankets one at a time. He had me heat stones and wrap them in flour sacking for her feet. He talked to her the whole while in a low, even voice. Not about anything, just talk, the way you gentle a spooked horse. and somewhere in the middle of it she came back enough to be afraid again. And the first clear thing she said in that house was, "Where am I?" "Mercer Place," Jonah said. 2 miles east of Harlan, you're safe. You're getting warm, don't try to sit up. She looked at him a long time, then at me, then around the room, and I watched her do the thing that told me more about her life than anything she said in the weeks after. She counted the exits. Door, window, the dark mouth of the hall. A woman doesn't learn to do that from a soft life. "What do you want?" she said. And Jonah, I'll never forget it, Jonah looked genuinely confused. "Want? Men don't open doors for nothing," she said, flat, like reading it off a wall. "So, what do you want?" The fire popped. Jonah crouched there with a warm cloth going cold in his hands, and I watched him understand that the question was the realest thing she'd said, and that it deserved a real answer. And I watched him not have one ready, because the truth, that he'd opened the door because he couldn't stand inside his own warm house and listen to her die, was a truth that sounded like a lie when you said it out loud. "I want you to not die in my road," he said finally. "After that we'll see." It wasn't comfort. It wasn't even kind, quite. But I think it was the first thing anybody'd said to her in a long while that she could believe, because it didn't promise more than a man could carry. And something in her, some held thing, let go a quarter inch. Not all the way, a quarter inch. She closed her eyes. "Ruth," she said, "my name is Ruth." That was the whole of it. No last name. A last name was a thing she'd learned to give out carefully, and she was right too, and I'd understand why before the week was out. I stayed up with her the first night while Jonah slept, then we traded. Toward morning the wind died and the cold went still and hard the way it does, and I sat in that chair with my little book open on my knee and I didn't know what to write. Finally I wrote, Deck 9. Town said no. Jay said yes. Woman called Ruth. Don't know yet what we opened the door to. I'd find out. We all would. But I want to leave you here for the night, the way I sat there in it, a stranger asleep in a dead woman's bed, a town full of shut doors 2 miles west, and the slow gray coming up over a thing none of us could yet see the shape of. She was 3 days finding her feet and 4 more before she'd take a meal in the same room as us. And in all that time she told us nothing, and the town told us everything. That's the order it came in. Understand that. We took her in not knowing, and then Harlan made very sure we knew. It started with the Reverend Calloway. He rode out on the 5th day with his collar on, which he only wore when he wanted you to remember he had God's ear and you didn't. And he stood in Jonah's yard and would not come inside, and he said he'd heard Jonah had taken in the Vain woman. Vain, first time I heard the name that had shut every door in town. "I took in a woman freezing in the road," Jonah said. "Didn't ask her name first." "Then I'll do you the kindness of telling you," Calloway said, and proceeded to do Jonah no kindness at all. "Here is what the town knew, or said it knew, and I'll lay it out the way it reached us so you feel it the way we did, sideways in pieces, each one uglier than the last. Ruth's husband had been Thomas Vane, and Thomas Vane, 3 years back and 100 miles north, had been hanged. That was the whole of what most of Harlan needed. Hanged. The word does its own work. You hear it and your mind fills in the rest, and the rest is always the worst thing. Nobody in town had been there. Nobody knew the particulars. But the particulars don't travel, only the word does, and the word had come down the stage road ahead of her, the way it always does, so that by the time Ruth Vane knocked on Della Forsythe's door, Della already had a story about her, and the story had a noose in it. "A hanged man's widow," Calloway said, "carries his account with her wherever she goes. We're a small place, Mercer. We've children we can't have." "Have what?" Jonah said. "What is it you think a froze woman in my road was going to do to your children?" The Reverend didn't have an answer to that one either, and like a man without an answer he reached for volume. He told Jonah he was inviting trouble. He told him the town had been patient with his ways, but there were limits. He said, and this is the part I wrote down, because it was the part that showed me what we were really in, he said, "There are those who'll wonder What kind of man takes in that kind of woman? That kind of woman, as if the rope around the husband's neck had been around hers. Jonah was quiet a long moment. Then he said, "You rode 2 miles in the cold to tell me to put her back out. Reverend, you could have stayed home and just let her die that first night. You'd have got the same result and saved yourself the trip." And he turned and went inside and left a man of God standing in his yard, and I won't lie, I enjoyed that more than was Christian of me. But here's the thing about a town story. It doesn't have to be true to be heavy, and it wasn't fully false either. That's what made it stick. Thomas Vane had been hanged. That part was iron. It was everything around it that the town had invented, and the inventing is what I want you to sit with, because I sat with it too, in that chair those nights. Because I'll confess something. After Calloway left, I looked at that woman different for a day. I did. I'd written "don't know yet" what we opened the door to, and now a part of me thought maybe I knew, and the knowing made me watch her hands, watch the door, the way she'd watched ours. Shame travels both directions in a thing like this. The town shamed her, and for about a day the town story got into me and made me small. What got it back out of me was a cold morning and a chicken. We had a hen gone broody and mean, and she'd flogged Sully bloody twice. And that morning I found Ruth in the yard before light with the hen settled in the crook of her arm like a cat, just standing there in the gray, scratching its neck with one finger, looking out east at nothing. "She bites," I said. "She didn't," Ruth said, and then after a while, not looking at me, "Animals never minded Thomas's people. We always had something half-wild around. He used to say a creature can tell the difference between a hand that wants something off you and a hand that just wants to touch your head a minute." She set the hen down. "Most people can't tell the difference. Animals always can." I think that was the day I stopped believing the town. Not because she said anything to clear her name. She never once did that, not the whole time. Never said he was innocent or it wasn't what they said. Never tried to sell us a better version. She just let the broody hen out of her arm and went back inside. And I stood there understanding that whatever Thomas Vane had or hadn't done, the woman in front of me was being hanged for it slow, one shut door at a time, and that I'd nearly helped. She and Jonah came to each other the way cold things thaw, from the edges in, slow, and with a lot of cracking. It wasn't sweet. I want to be careful telling you this because the easy version is sweet and the easy version is a lie. They didn't fall into anything. Two solitary people who have each been burned aren't kindling. They're more like two stones you set near the fire. They warm, but they warm careful, and they keep their own shape. What they had at first was work. Ruth could not abide being kept. The second she could stand, she was after a task, any task, and she did them hard and well and silent. And I came to see that work was the only place she felt she'd earned her air. She mended every torn thing on the place. She had the kitchen running like she'd run it years. And when Jonah tried, once clumsy, to tell her she didn't have to, that she was a guest, she rounded on him with the most words I'd heard out of her at once. "I have been a guest. A guest is a thing they're waiting to be done with. I would rather be of use than be a guest, and if you can't tell the difference between paying my way and paying you off, then you're as simple as the rest of them, and I'll be gone by Friday." She didn't leave by Friday, but she'd shown us the shape of the wound that somewhere back of all this, kindness had been a bill she'd had to pay and pay badly. Somebody, sometime after Thomas, had taken her in and made her sorry for it. I never learned exactly who or how. I didn't need to. You could read the cost of it in how she flinched at the word guest. The thaw between them, when it came over small things. He noticed she favored her left wrist and never said so, but started leaving the heavy jobs to me and Sully without making a show of why. She noticed he didn't sleep and started a pot of something on the stove at night so the house smelled lived in when he came down at his bad hour. And they'd sit, the two of them, not talking, two people awake for the same reason, which is the closest thing to company some folks ever get. I'd come down some mornings and find 2 cups in the basin, and the chess set Esther'd left moved 3 squares from where it had been, a game played in silence and never finished, picked up the next night where they'd dropped it. I started to hope. God help me. I started to hope for them, the way you hope for two people who have each decided the world is a closed door and are slowly, against all their training, deciding maybe one room of it isn't. And that's exactly when the town came for the second time. And this time, they didn't send the reverend. They sent paper. A man came out from the county seat with a satchel and a way of not looking at you, and he had documents, and the documents said that Thomas Vane had died owing, and that the owing didn't die with him, and that as his widow and the holder of what little he'd left, Ruth Vane was answerable for it, and that a man in Harlan, a Mr. Prout, had bought up the paper on that debt cheap, the way you buy a thing you mean to use as a weapon. Prout, the storekeeper, the one Jonah had caught with the weighted scale years back, the one who'd watched Ruth knock and never moved his lamp. I want you to see how neat it was, because cruelty in a small place is usually neat. Prout couldn't make us turn her out with words. The Reverend had tried that and failed. So he bought her debt, a dead man's debt, pennies on the dollar, and now he could ruin her legally, and ruin by extension the man fool enough to shelter her. He could put a price on the door Jonah had opened, and the price was more than the Mercer place was worth. That was the night I learned what Jonah had decided. I found out because Ruth tried to leave. I caught her in the barn past midnight, the man's coat back on, her little bag packed, saddling a horse she didn't know how to ride. And when she heard me, she went still as a struck animal, and then she said, fast and low, "Don't wake him." "Ruth." "Don't wake him, Amos. This is mine. I brought it to his door, and I'll take it back out the same door, and that's the end of it. He's a good man, and I won't watch him lose his place over a dead man's accounts. Help me or don't, but don't wake him." And that's the morally heavy thing, the one I promised you'd be in here, except it wasn't a villain's choice or a hero's choice. It was just a true one, and it cut both ways. She was right. If she left, Prout's paper was worthless. He'd bought it to drive her out, and gone is gone. The debt followed her, not the ranch. Jonah would keep his place. The arithmetic was clean. The only thing it cost was her, and she'd long ago decided she was the cheapest thing on the table. I stood there in the barn with the lantern, and I knew if I let her go she'd be a hanged man's widow on a winter road again by morning, fifth door of the night again, forever. And I knew if I woke him I was handing Jonah a choice that might take everything he had. I woke him. I'll tell you why I woke him in the third part, and what he did, and what the town did, and how it ended, which wasn't the way you're maybe bracing for, and wasn't the way I'd have written it either. But I'll leave you here in the barn, lantern light, a woman with her foot half in a stirrup she didn't know how to use, trying to slip out the same door she'd been carried in through, trying, the only way she knew how, to be of use one last time. The way she saw it, the kindest thing she could do for the man who saved her was to disappear before she cost him anything. She was wrong about that, but I understood why she believed it. By then I understood everything except what Jonah would do when his feet hit that cold floor. He came down without a shirt and without a word and stood in the barn door, and Ruth wouldn't look at him. And for a long moment the only sound was the horse shifting and a beam settling somewhere in the cold. "Take the saddle off," Jonah said. "Jonah." "Take the saddle off, Ruth. You don't know how to ride, and that mare's green, and you'll break your neck in the dark, and then Prout wins anyway, and I'll have lost the place and you, and I'll have to go on living in it. So take the saddle off and come inside, and we'll talk about it like people." She didn't move. So he crossed the barn and started undoing the cinch himself, slow, and she watched his hands do it, and I watched something come apart in her face that had been held together a long time. Not crying. She didn't cry. It was worse than crying. It was the look of a person whose plan had been the only thing keeping them upright, and now the plan was lying on the floor with the saddle. "You don't understand," she said. "It's not a sum a man pays once. Thomas, the things they said he did, some of them he did, Jonah. Not the worst of it, but not none of it. I'm not a wronged angel. I knew the man I married, and I stayed, and that makes me." She stopped. "Della Forsythe isn't wrong about what I am. I'm just not what she thinks I am. and I will not let one decent man go broke proving a point to a town that'll hate him for it either way. And Jonah set the saddle down and straightened up and said the thing that ended it. Not loud. He never was loud. I didn't open the door because you were innocent, he said. I never thought you were. I opened it because you were cold. He looked at her. I'm not trying to save a wronged angel. I know exactly what I let in. I let in a person. And a person doesn't have to earn not freezing to death. That's the whole of what I believe, Ruth. It's about the only thing I believe, and Prout can buy every debt in the county and it won't change it. Now come inside. It's cold and I'm standing here in my undershirt for you. She came inside. I won't pretend money problems dissolve because a man says a true thing in a barn. They don't. Morning came and the paper was still real and Prout still held it, and the sum was still more than the place could make in 3 good years, and we spent a hard week not knowing. What broke it wasn't grand. I want to be honest about that too, because the grand version, the town, has a change of heart. Everybody learns a lesson. The church bells ring. That version is a lie they sell you, and the true version is smaller and stranger and means more. It was old Della Forsyth, the woman who'd shut the first door. She rode out alone. Della never rode anywhere. She was 60 and stout and hated horses. And she sat in Jonah's kitchen stiff as a fence post and would not take coffee. And she said she'd come to say one thing and then she'd go. She said, my sister married a man who was hanged. That was it. That was the whole of why she'd shut the door, and the whole of why she'd come to open it. 30 years back, in another state, her own sister had been a hanged man's wife, and Della had watched the town do to her sister exactly what Harlan was doing to Ruth, and Della had been young and frightened and had said nothing and let it happen, and her sister had died on a road somewhere of the cold or worse, and Della had carried it 30 years, and when Ruth Vane knocked on her door it had not been a stranger standing there. It had been her sister. And Della had shut the door on her sister twice in one lifetime, and the second time had been more than she could hold. She didn't say all that the smooth way I just did. She said it in pieces, looking at the table, an old woman cracking open a thing she'd sealed before half the town was born. And then she put an envelope on the table, money, her own, more than I'd have guessed she had, and she said it wasn't charity, it was a debt. Her debt, 30 years owed to a different woman she couldn't pay anymore, and she'd be obliged if Ruth would let her finally pay it to somebody. And Ruth, who would not take charity, who tried to freeze rather than be a guest, who'd packed a bag at midnight rather than cost a good man $1. Ruth looked at that envelope a long, long time. And she pushed it back across the table. I can't take your sister's debt off you, she said, gentle, the gentlest I ever heard her. It's not mine to forgive, but I'll sit with you while you carry it if you want. That I can do. And she put her hand over Della's hand, the hand that had cupped a lamp dim against her, and she held it. I had to go out to the porch. I'm not ashamed to say it. A man my age, out on the porch in the cold so 2 women wouldn't see his face. It got settled in the end, in the small grinding way real things get settled. Della talked. An old woman who's kept her own counsel for 30 years, when she finally talks, a town listens. She told her sister's story up and down Harlan, and she made them sit in it, and shame did slow work on the ones it could reach. The Hadleys came around with a side of pork and didn't quite apologize and didn't quite not. The debt got chipped at from a dozen directions, not paid off in a grand gesture, just made bearable, which is what most help amounts to when it's honest. And Prout held his paper and his grudge and got, in the end, the worst thing a small town can do to a man, which is decide quietly that they're done with him. The scale business came back up. Folks started driving to Bishop's Crossing for their goods. He sold out inside 2 years and left. And nobody waved. Ruth and Jonah didn't marry that spring or the next. I think you want me to tell you they did, with the church full and Della in the front pew, and I could tell you that and you'd be happy and it would be a lie. They were not people built for a thing that quick. What they were was 2 stones near a fire, warming careful, keeping their shape. But I'll tell you the last thing, the thing I came out here to leave you with. and then I'll quit. The next December, a year on from the night the town said no, it came a cold snap again, the killing kind, and I was at the Mercer place at dusk closing up the barn when I saw Jonah come out onto the porch and stand there looking west toward town the way he did. And Ruth came out behind him with 2 cups and handed him one, and they stood there in the cold neither of them needed to be standing in. And Jonah said something to her I wasn't meant to hear, and she laughed. I'd never heard her laugh, not once that whole first year, and it wasn't a big laugh. It was small and rusty like a hinge that hasn't moved in years. And then she leaned her shoulder against his arm, just leaned, the weight of her against him, the way you do when you've finally decided a thing will hold. And I stood in the barn door with my little book in my coat, and I did not write it down. Some things you keep out of the book. Some things you just let happen in front of you in the cold, the warm light behind them, and you let them belong only to the night they happened in. I went home. The wind came up. 2 miles west, the town shut its doors against the cold the way a town does, and out east, one door stayed.